Hi everybody, it's OC, editor for World Aviation Festival, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dennis Cary, aviation consultant expert, former CCO, Copa Airlines, American United, many hats and a long history in the industry.
So that just means I'm old.
Yeah, potentially. Now obviously you just come out of being on sort of C-suite with an airline, and an interesting moment for the industry, lots of sort of crises and various things going on. But say you were back at Copa or any of the other airlines you worked at before, how would you sort of look to respond to the current sort of cost spike we're seeing with sort of, the jet fuel, or some people call it a crisis, it's potentially a bit overused. What's your perspective on this, and how do you think airlines can sort of plan the best way forward amid these sort of fluctuations?
I think the key is with the industry, people in the industry have learned, the next crisis is always right around the corner. So when you're not in the middle of the crisis, you're spending time trying to make sure that you are resilient for that next one. And as I always say, like as a chief commercial officer, the role is executing and delivering the results this month, next quarter, next year. But always thinking about like what's coming around the corner and how can we be better prepared. And so, making sure your execution is solid on delivering for your customers and producing revenue and thinking about what the next innovation is. And then I think particularly, and we heard it in many of the conversations here, making sure in your business plan, what flexibility levers you will pull, particularly around capacity when that next crisis comes. And so I think, so far, because everyone's uncertain how long this particular crisis will last, it's uncertain. Some are already pulling that capacity lever and reducing their schedules. Some are holding out, hoping for a quick resolution. But I think planning for and knowing that crisis is coming and being ready is critical, because if you hit the front end of one of these crises and you don't already have that playbook written, then those are the ones that get in trouble. And I think, the best management teams have learned that lesson over all of the, numerous crises over the years.
Yeah, definitely a good motto for the aviation industry, like the only constant is change, especially in the current geopolitical environment. Everything's happening all the time. Obviously, you've recently come out of being at Copa, based in Panama. What's your sort of perspective on the current Latin American aviation market? Obviously, sort of more developing market compared to the North American market, which is a big share of the conversation today. But where do you think are the big opportunities here, and how resilient do you think it could be in the face of all these developments going on?
I think setting aside the current crisis, which will resolve soon, later, whatever, over time. We heard it from Roberto Alvo yesterday morning, CEO of LATAM. I think all of us who work in that environment see that this is one of the least penetrated markets in the world in terms of per capita trips on airplanes. And as the economies continue to grow and develop, and therefore more people get into the segment of the population who can afford to travel, the growth in that region will just continue. So I think, generally all boats will rise, and the big constraints really are around infrastructure and to some extent taxation. And those are topics that the airline forums, be it ALTA, the Regional Airline Association, or IATA, are constantly working with the governments about. But the natural progression should be very bullish on Latin America overall. And as long as we get the right, partnership from particularly governments and airport operators, like that should be an enormous economic growth engine for the region.
Are there any sort of specific segments of travelers within the region that you think are either becoming big aviation customers or should be targeted more intensely by airlines?
Well, I think as a still developing market, it's, unlike some of the mature markets where, that premium business traveler is the big driver for a lot of airlines. Of course, that's the lucrative segment that every airline wants, but really we're talking about sort of the new entrant travelers just expanding the pie. And so these are the VFR travelers going to see family that lives somewhere else, or now being able to take vacations in destinations that require a flight that just weren't available to them before. So it's much more on the leisure and personal family type travel. that I see we'll see the explosion. And again, as the economies grow and businesses continue to grow, the top end of the business traveler segment will also grow. But it's really about that, that leisure and discretionary traveler that I think will help grow the pie.
And to talk a bit more about demographics, obviously the North American market, some of the big spenders are older people, especially as the population continues to age.
Yeah.
While on the other hand, we have a very sort of tech savvy Gen Z market, and also within Latin America, very mobile heavy users.
Yeah.
Are we sort of at risk of a demographic split as airlines become too focused on technology, or do you think there's a sort of middle way forward to satisfy both customer bases?
Yeah, I don't think so. Ultimately the exact preference for how they choose travel, I think, is less important, as long as we as the provider are understanding those different needs. But I think you can absolutely do both. Look, I mean, especially here in North America, that generational wealth created over the last 40 years through real estate and the stock market, has just created enormous appetite for premium leisure travel in a way we could not have imagined 20 years ago, right? The people in the front of the airplane were people on expense accounts, and now it's
It's your grandma.
Yeah, and I'm getting to be there, right? And there's people who are at a stage in their life where premium experiences are what they are interested in, and they have the discretionary wealth to choose that, and so that has been one of the most important shifts. I think it's certainly different in different geographies. We clearly have that segment in Latin America in terms of origin travelers, but not at the same proportion, I think. And so, I think for Latin American airlines, for example, that have big exposure to the U.S., you have to be conscious of that and make sure you're staying competitive. But also there's a big part of their markets that don't quite have that same dynamic. So that's where I think, being premium enough to play in that space, but also, let's say, cost efficient enough to be able to offer the low fares to bring those new travelers in. That's the balancing act, I think, for Latin travelers. That sort of Gen Z versus wealthy seniors, I don't see that as a big risk of somehow getting lost in the middle. Yeah.
Okay. And I couldn't have you on the sofa without asking about technology.
Yeah.
So sort of cover that. What sort of role do you see technology playing as airlines move forward? Obviously, we're gradually overcoming some of the restrictions of legacy systems and getting into a more sort of AI-focused airline. But how do you see that progressing at the moment? And do you think airlines are missing any big opportunities, or are they, doing it right so far?
Well, what I would say is, as somebody who spent a lot of my career kind of on that boundary between tech and commercial, in some very distant past, I have an undergrad degree in computer science and was a software developer and, implemented one of the first O&D revenue management systems 25 years ago. So I've sort of been in this space for a long time. I think I'm really impressed by the quality of the startups that are here. I think, without getting too wrapped up in the AI hype, I think many of them are attacking some really critical problems in the industry. What does pricing revenue management look like going forward? Obviously, in this current environment, a lot of work going around fuel optimization and other sort of efficiency plays in the operating side, resiliency plays. How do you recover when there's a problem, either the customer or the operation? So it does feel like there is a lot of energy and a lot of really good work going on in some spaces that need fresh thinking around technology. And then, like most people, I'm kind of at the wait and see for AI as the big disruptor. One of the tech industry kind of experts that I follow, he kind of has this sort of dichotomy of it's coming and it's going to change the world. And sort of one of the examples when all the experts are saying what's going to, all white collar jobs are going to get wiped out by AI. Well, let's wait and see what happens, because the internet was coming, it was the next big thing, but none of us were saying in 2002 that taxi drivers were going to get disrupted. And now we all see obviously how that happened, right? So, exactly, it's probably too early to predict exactly what it'll be. And on the other hand, like usage really of the big platforms is super, super small. You have this tiny infinitesimal group of people who are on the paid platforms, including many of our startups here, I'm sure. Then you have people who are using it, but the vast majority of people are still at 1 time a month or 2 times a month. So it's early days, but it does feel like the power of cheap computing resources and what looks like probably a big disruptor in AI will be an enabler to perhaps solve some of these really hard problems in our industry in a way that hasn't been before. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch that space and see who really cracks some code that's been stubborn for a long time.
I just want to touch on briefly as well, because you mentioned efficiency, sustainability, and one of the ways that I'm hoping at least this fuel crisis will help airlines think a bit about how they can be less wasteful of resources, which always a good goal for anyone. But do you think we've seen our eye being taken off the ball of sustainability recently? Is it less dominant in conversations? And how are we seeing that movement play out? Is it possible for aviation to become a sustainable industry?
So here, what I would say is, look, sustainability and, step change in sustainability ultimately is going to come from the manufacturers and the engine makers. Like, we don't build the machines, we fly them. Of course, we as the customers try to influence where that's going. But fundamentally, when you step back, as one of the 3 largest costs at every airline, the incentives are perfectly aligned. Like, burning less fuel, regardless of the righteousness of that objective, like it is an economic, and the economic incentives are perfectly aligned. So I think, if anything, this will create incentives to look for that next small iterative thing you can do. But the step change has to come with new technology, and the history is the R&D for those new programs takes decades. And we know about a few of those potential things that are in the pipeline and starting to get talked about, but it feels like that next generation that might give us hybrid or short stage length electric, whatever, they're sort of in their infancy now. It'll be years really before we get there. So in the meantime, saving fuel in the existing platforms is already something airlines are absolutely motivated to do, and more so with fuel at $4 a gallon instead of $2 a gallon.
And I'm aware we're running out of time, so just to wrap up, you touched on the fact that you're excited by some of the startups on display here. But what else have you got out of the event? Is there any particular sort of topic, solution, or conversation that really sort of excited you while you were here today or yesterday?
I guess what I would say is, listening to, Roberto Alvo and David Neeleman and Alexis from WestJet and, the Allegiant CEO. I mean, it's I think refreshing to hear that most of them still at this stage are sort of confident that they understand what their path through is going to be. And, those companies are very different in different stages of their evolution. And I think previous crises, have seen a much more disparate view and a less certain view of what should happen. Now, obviously, we lost Spirit recently, but that was kind of already in the works, and their business model had already been disrupted. But at least so far, in this crisis, it seems like the industry is better prepared as a whole, perhaps, than recent crises. So as somebody who spent his life in the industry, I hope that's the case, and I was encouraged by that.
Well, definitely a topic to revisit next year.
Yes, indeed.
We're back in Miami, but Dennis, thank you so much for joining me today. It was really nice to speak to you.
Elsie, great to be with you all.